The pickup truck rolled to a stop where the asphalt gave way to gravel, and for a moment Caleb Brennan just sat there with both hands still gripping the steering wheel. Through the dusty windshield, he could see the farmhouse waiting at the end of the long driveway, its white paint gone gray with age and weather, the porch sagging slightly on the east side where it had always sagged for as long as he could remember. 3 months had passed since the funeral. 3 months since he had stood in the rain watching them lower his grandfather into the Nebraska soil, and in all that time the house had stood empty, waiting. The way houses do when the people who gave them life are gone. He killed the engine and the silence rushed in like water filling a hull. No sound but the wind moving through the cornfield to his left. That particular whisper that only corn makes in late spring when the stalks are young and green and full of promise. His grandfather used to say, you could hear the crop thinking if you listened close enough, planning its route toward the sun, calculating the odds of rain. Caleb had thought it was nonsense when he was 12 and newly orphaned and angry at the world. Now at 27, he wondered if maybe the old man had been right about more things than he had given him credit for. The letters from the attorney sat in a manila folder on the passenger seat. Henry Hank Brennan, Henry Brennan, deceased March 15th, estate to be settled, properties to be assessed, decisions to be made. 320 acres of prime Nebraska farmland. A house built in 1947, 2 barns, 3 outbuildings, equipment ranging from valuable to scrap metal. Worth perhaps $800,000 if he sold to the right buyer. Enough to fund the rest of his engineering degree and set him up in Lincoln or Omaha where young men with ambition belonged. His grandfather would understand. The old man had always been practical above all else. Caleb stepped out into air that smelled of turned earth and distant rain. Storm clouds were building to the west, tall thunderheads going purple at their bases. The kind of weather that made farmers nervous and meteorologists reach for their radars. But it was still hours away, enough time to do what he had come here to do. Walk through the house, make a list, decide what stayed and what went, reduce a life to an inventory. The front steps creaked under his boots, the same creak they had made every morning when his grandfather descended them to begin another day of work that never seemed to end. Caleb found the spare key where it had always been, under the third flower pot from the left, beneath the dead geranium his grandfather had forgotten to water sometime last winter. The door swung open with a groan of hinges that needed oil. Inside the house was exactly as he remembered, and nothing like it at all. The furniture remained in its familiar places, the couch where Hank had sat every evening after dinner, the recliner positioned to face the window that looked out over the cornfield, the bookshelf with its collection of farming almanacs and Louis L'Amour westerns. But something essential had been extracted, some animating force that made a house a home. Now it was just rooms and objects, a stage after the actors had departed. Caleb moved through the space slowly, cataloging. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee and bacon grease. His grandfather's jacket hung on the hook by the back door, the canvas stiff with age and weather. In the living room, dust motes drifted through the afternoon light, and when Caleb sat in the recliner, the worn cushions held the shape of someone else's body, someone who would never sit there again. He found himself staring out the window at the cornfield, at the rows marching away toward the horizon in perfect geometry. 15 years he had lived in this house after the accident that took his parents. 15 years of learning how to work the land, how to fix what broke, how to endure the long winters and longer silences. His grandfather had not been a man of many words. When he spoke, it was to convey information or give instruction, and affection, if it existed, was expressed through action rather than declaration. Yet Caleb had never doubted that he was wanted here, that his presence mattered, that in his grandfather's quiet way, the old man loved him. The photograph on the mantel showed them together, Caleb at 16 holding up a prize pumpkin at the county fair, his grandfather standing beside him with the smallest hint of a smile. That smile had been rare as snow in July, and Caleb realized now that he had very few images of his grandfather looking genuinely happy. There had always been something withheld, some portion of himself kept locked away where no one could reach it. By the time Caleb made it upstairs, the clouds had moved closer, and the light coming through the windows had gone greenish and strange. His old bedroom looked like a museum exhibit dedicated to a boy who no longer existed. Football trophies on the shelf, posters of bands he had not thought about in years. The narrow bed where he had slept through 1,000 nights of dreamless exhaustion after long days in the field. His grandfather's room was at the end of the hall, the door closed as it had always been closed. Caleb stood with his hand on the knob for a long moment before pushing it open. The space beyond was spare and masculine, almost monastic in its simplicity. A double bed with a plain quilt, a dresser with nothing on top but a lamp and a water glass. The closet held work clothes and 2 suits, one for church and one for funerals. On the nightstand sat a pair of reading glasses and a well-worn Bible that Caleb knew his grandfather had never actually read, but kept there anyway because it had belonged to his own father. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low sustained note like something fundamental shifting in the earth. Caleb went to the window and watched the storm advancing across the plains, a wall of dark rain marching steadily eastward. It would be here soon. He should close the windows, secure the outbuildings, make sure nothing important got damaged. Instead, he found himself opening the closet again, running his hand along the row of flannel shirts, breathing in the smell of work and Old Spice and something else, something indefinable that was purely his grandfather. At the back of the closet behind the winter coats, he found a cardboard box he had never noticed before. It was sealed with packing tape gone brown and brittle with age, and when he lifted it, the contents shifted with a muffled sliding sound. Caleb carried it to the bed and stared at it for a moment before using his pocket knife to slice through the tape. Inside were files, manila folders stuffed with papers, photographs, newspaper clippings, all of it organized with the same meticulous care his grandfather had brought to everything. Caleb pulled out the first folder and opened it. A birth certificate, yellowed with age. Diane Rachel Brennan, born March 15, 1964, at Hastings Memorial Hospital. Mother Evelyn Grace Shaw, father Henry Thomas Brennan. Caleb read it 3 times before the information penetrated. His grandfather had a child, a daughter, born 61 years ago, which meant she would be 60 now if she was still alive. Diane. He had never heard that name spoken in this house, not once in 15 years. He opened another folder and found photographs. A baby swaddled in white, a toddler on a tricycle, a young girl in a school portrait, dark hair and blue eyes and a gap-toothed smile, a teenager in a graduation gown. His hands shook as he spread the contents of the box across the bed. There were dozens of photographs spanning decades. Report cards from schools in Des Moines, Iowa. Newspaper clippings about a nursing school graduation. A wedding announcement. Birth notices for 2 boys named Marcus and Simon. Receipts from a postal service. Packages sent to an address in Des Moines every year on March 15th. Always the same note according to copies kept in the file. From a friend who wishes you well. Thunder cracked directly overhead, and rain began hammering the roof with sudden violence. Caleb barely noticed. He was reading a letter written in his grandfather's careful hand, dated February 2023, just a month before the old man had died. To whomever finds this, it began. I have kept silent for 61 years. Perhaps that was a mistake. Perhaps it was the only choice I could make. Either way, the time for silence is over. The letter explained in sparse, factual sentences what the documents had already revealed. Evelyn Shaw, the love of his life, pregnant with their child, diagnosed with cancer 4 months before the due date. Her refusal to undergo treatment that might harm the baby. Her death 3 days after giving birth. And then the decision that had apparently haunted him for the rest of his life. The decision to give the baby to a couple named Bob and Ellen Thornton who could provide what he could not. A mother, a stable home, a future uncomplicated by poverty and grief, and a young man who had no idea how to raise a child alone. I told myself I was doing what was best for her, the letter continued. The Thorntons were good people, a doctor and a teacher. They had been trying for years to have a child. They looked at Diane like she was the answer to every prayer they had ever prayed. And I was just a farmer with a failing crop and a mortgage I could barely pay. What right did I have to keep her? But I never stopped watching over her. I followed her life from a distance. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy or pain. I was there, always there, just never where she could see me. And if that was wrong, if that was a violation of her privacy or her peace, then I am guilty. But I loved her, God help me. I loved that girl more than my own life. And loving her from far away was the only way I knew how. The storm was directly overhead now. Rain lashing the windows, wind howling around the eaves of the old house. Caleb sat on his grandfather's bed, surrounded by the evidence of a secret life, and for the first time since the funeral, he wept. Not for himself, not even for his grandfather, but for this woman named Diane who had spent 60 years not knowing she had a father who loved her, and for the man who had spent 60 years not knowing how to bridge that distance. When he could breathe again, Caleb gathered up the photographs and papers with shaking hands. There had to be more. His grandfather had been too thorough, too methodical, to keep everything in a single box. He went back to the closet and searched deeper, pulling out bills of old tax returns and farm records. And then he saw it. Behind the hanging clothes mounted on the back wall of the closet was a small door he had never noticed before. It was maybe 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, the kind of access panel that led to storage space under the eaves. Caleb pulled it open and shone his phone's flashlight into the darkness beyond. The space was perhaps 10 feet deep and lined with shelves. On those shelves were journals, dozens of them, leather-bound volumes arranged by year from 1964 to 2024. His grandfather's entire adult life, documented and hidden away, where no one would ever find it unless they were specifically looking. He pulled out the most recent volume, dated 2024, and flipped it open to a random page. March 15th, Diane's birthday. She turned 60 today. 60 years since I last held her, since I signed those papers and watched the Thorntons carry her away. Michael told me she had lunch with her sons and grandchildren at that Italian place she likes in Des Moines. He says she looked happy. That is all I ever wanted. Her happiness. Even if I could never be part of it. Caleb sat on the floor of the closet with the journal in his lap and read entry after entry. His grandfather's voice, usually so taciturn in life, flowed freely on these pages. Observations about Diane's life, worries about her health, pride in her accomplishments, regret for his absence, and woven through it all, a thread of such profound loneliness that Caleb felt it like a physical weight pressing on his chest. April 3rd, 2009. The entry made him stop cold. I was going to call her today. After 45 years of silence, I was finally going to pick up the phone and tell her the truth. I had the number written on a piece of paper. I had practiced what I would say 100 times, but then Daniel and Sarah died. Their car went off the road in the rain, and Caleb became an orphan at 12 years old. He needs me. He needs a home and stability and someone who will not leave him. So I did not make the call. I put the number back in the drawer, and I chose to be the grandfather Caleb needs instead of the father Diane never had. Perhaps that makes me a coward. Perhaps it makes me selfish. But I cannot serve two broken hearts. I can only do my best with one. The date swam in Caleb's vision. April 3rd, the day his parents died, the day his grandfather had driven through the night to reach him at the hospital where he sat alone and terrified, not knowing what would happen to him. The day Hank Brennan had knelt down and looked him in the eye and said without hesitation or doubt, "You are coming home with me." He had chosen Caleb. Over his own daughter, over 60 years of longing and regret, he had chosen to give himself to a traumatized boy who needed him. And he had done it without ever asking for gratitude or acknowledgement, without ever suggesting that it was a sacrifice. He had simply shown up and stayed, year after year, until Caleb was grown and safe and ready to face the world on his own. Thunder shook the house, and Caleb realized he was crying again, great racking sobs that he could not control or suppress. He grieved for his grandfather, who had carried this burden alone. He grieved for this aunt he had never known existed. He grieved for all the years of silence and separation and love that had nowhere to go but into pages of a journal no one was meant to read. When the storm finally began to ease, when the rain gentled from a deluge to a steady drumming, Caleb forced himself to stand. He gathered the journals and carried them downstairs along with the box of documents. In the kitchen, he made coffee from grounds that had probably gone stale months ago, and he sat at the table where he and his grandfather had shared thousands of meals, and he began to read. The first journal started the day after Diane was born. My daughter came into the world at 6:23 this morning. She weighs 7 pounds and 4 ounces. She has Evelyn's eyes. Evelyn held her for 10 minutes, and then she slipped away from us, slipped into unconsciousness, and the doctors say she will not wake again. They give her days, maybe a week, and I am supposed to care for this tiny, helpless creature when I can barely breathe past the grief closing my throat. The entries from those first weeks were jagged with pain. Evelyn's death, the funeral, the meeting with Bob and Ellen Thornton, who agreed to take the baby, to raise her as their own, to give her everything Hank could not, and then the signing of the papers, the moment when he officially relinquished his parental rights. I held her one last time before they took her. She made this little sound, almost like a sigh, like she knew, like she understood what I was doing and why. I told her I loved her. I told her I was sorry, and then I gave her away. What followed was a chronicle of distance and devotion. Hank had not hired private investigators or surveillance teams. He had done something far simpler and in its own way more heartbreaking. He had simply paid attention. He subscribed to the Des Moines newspaper. He drove the 90 miles to Des Moines once a month and parked down the street from the Thornton house, watching from afar. He befriended a postal worker named Michael Price who agreed to mail anonymous gifts every year on Diane's birthday. He went to her high school graduation and sat in the back row. He attended her nursing school ceremony and left before anyone could notice him. He was there for her wedding, a distant figure at the edge of the crowd. He saw her sons being born, saw her life unfold through the narrow keyhole of observation. Caleb read until his eyes burned and the coffee went cold in his cup. He read until the storm passed and the evening sun broke through the clouds, painting everything gold. And then he found the entry that changed everything. June 15th, 1980, 16 years old today. I drove to Council Bluffs where she works part-time at a bakery. I told myself I would just watch from across the street. But then I walked inside. I ordered coffee. She asked me if I wanted sugar. I said no. She smiled. Her mother's smile. I stayed for exactly 8 minutes, then I left before I could do something stupid like tell her the truth. It was the closest I have ever been to her, the closest I will ever be. And it was enough. It had to be enough. There was a photograph tucked between the pages, a grainy image of a bakery counter, and behind it a teenage girl with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, smiling at the camera. No, not at the camera, at whoever was taking the picture, at her father, who she did not know was her father. Caleb set the journal down and walked to the window. Outside, the world had been washed clean by the storm. The corn stood stray odor, the air smelled of ozone and wet earth, and somewhere out beyond the fence line, a meadowlark was singing its descending trill. It was the kind of evening his grandfather had loved, the kind that made all the hard work seem worthwhile. But Caleb was not thinking about the farm or the storm or the evening light. He was thinking about a woman named Diane who was 60 years old and living in Des Moines, and who had no idea that the man who raised him had spent his entire life loving her from a distance. She deserved to know. She deserved to understand that she had not been abandoned or forgotten or unloved. She deserved to read these journals and see these photographs and learn that every day of her life someone had been watching over her with fierce protective devotion. The decision made itself. Caleb would find her. He would tell her the truth. He would give her the journals and the letters and the photographs, and he would let her decide what to do with them. It was not about easing his own conscience or fulfilling his grandfather's unspoken wishes. It was about honoring the love that had shaped his grandfather's life, and he was beginning to understand his own. He spent the next hour searching the house more thoroughly. In his grandfather's desk, he found a locked drawer, and in a kitchen cabinet, he found the key. Inside the drawer was a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be financial records, scholarships established in Evelyn Shaw's name, anonymous donations to the Thornton family when they faced financial difficulty, a trust fund set up to cover medical expenses if Diane ever needed it. His grandfather had not just watched, he had protected, he had provided, he had found ways to be a father without ever claiming the title. There were also letters, dozens of them, written over the years but never sent. Dear Diane, they began. Today you started kindergarten. Dear Diane, you made the honor roll again. Dear Diane, I saw you got married today. Each one was dated and carefully composed, and each one ended the same way. I love you. I am proud of you. I am sorry. As darkness fell, Caleb carried everything back to the kitchen and spread it across the table. The journals, the photographs, the letters, the financial records, a life's worth of secret devotion laid bare. Tomorrow he would start trying to find Diane. He would reach out somehow and hope she would be willing to listen to a stranger who claimed to be her nephew. But tonight he would read. Tonight he would try to understand the man who had raised him, this quiet farmer who had carried such a profound secret with such grace. The man who had chosen duty over desire, sacrifice over satisfaction, and who had loved two people completely in two entirely different ways. The wind picked up again, but it was no longer the angry howl of the storm. It was the familiar evening breeze that always came up after the rain, carrying the smell of wet corn and turned earth. Caleb made fresh coffee and opened the next journal. Outside, somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. The house settled around him with its familiar creaks and sighs. And in the silence between the words on the page, he could almost hear his grandfather's voice. I did the best I could, it seemed to say. It was not perfect, it was not enough, but it was all I had to give. Caleb turned the page and kept reading. The night stretched long ahead of him, full of discoveries yet to be made, truths yet to be uncovered. But for now, there was only this: the quiet house, the old journals, and the slow unfolding story of a love so great it had to hide itself to survive. Outside in the field where the storm had passed, a scarecrow stood watch over the young corn. Old Ben, his grandfather had called it, this rough assemblage of wood and straw and flannel shirt that had guarded the crops for as long as Caleb could remember. In the morning, he would need to check the damage from the storm, see what had survived and what would need to be replanted. But the scarecrow still stood, arms outstretched, keeping its faithful vigil, just as his grandfather had done. Just as he had stood watch over a daughter he could never claim, never hold, never tell the truth, standing guard from a distance, protecting what he loved by never letting it know he was there. Caleb sat at the kitchen table and read his grandfather's words and understood finally what it meant to be a keeper. Not of land or property or material things, but of promises, of love, of the small, fierce hopes that carry us through the dark nights when we are most alone. The journals would tell him the rest, but already he knew enough to know that he would not sell this farm, enough to know that he would find Diane and give her what her father could not, enough to know that some stories do not end when people die. They only wait for someone brave enough to continue telling them. He picked up his phone and began to search. Diane Thornton, Des Moines, Iowa. The name his grandfather had written 1,000 times in these journals. The daughter who was also, impossibly, his aunt. The woman who deserved to know she had always been loved. The coffee grew cold again. The night deepened, and Caleb read on, bearing witness to a secret that had been kept too long, ready now to be spoken into the light. The morning after the storm dawned clear and cool, the kind of early June day that makes the Great Plains feel like the edge of heaven. Caleb woke at the kitchen table with his cheek pressed against the open journal, his neck stiff and his eyes gritty from too little sleep and too many tears. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny spirits through the still air. For a moment, he could not remember where he was or why his chest felt hollow. Then he saw the journal spread across the table, and it all came flooding back. He made coffee with hands that still trembled, slightly, standing at the counter where his grandfather had stood 10,000 mornings, looking out the same window at the same view. The cornfield stretched away toward the horizon, its young stalks brilliant green in the morning light. Old Ben the Scarecrow stood at his post near the eastern fence line, arms spread wide as if embracing the new day. From this distance, the figure looked almost human, almost alive, and Caleb wondered how many times his grandfather had stood exactly here and seen the same thing and thought of the daughter he had given away. The coffee was bitter and too strong, but he drank it anyway, needing the jolt of caffeine to clear his head. He had spent most of the night reading through the journals, moving chronologically through the decades of his grandfather's life. What emerged from those pages was a portrait of devotion so complete and so carefully hidden that even now, with all the evidence before him, Caleb struggled to comprehend it. His grandfather had not merely watched Diane from afar. He had woven himself into the fabric of her life in ways so subtle that she could never have detected them. When the Thornton family faced foreclosure in 1978, after Dr. Thornton was sued for malpractice, an anonymous benefactor had paid off their mortgage. The deed of gift was in the locked drawer of Hank's desk, along with a letter from Bob Thornton expressing bewildered gratitude to a stranger who would not identify himself. When Diane applied to nursing school in 1982, she received the inaugural Evelyn Shaw Memorial Scholarship, established by an unnamed donor and administered through the university with instructions that the recipient must never know the source of the funds. The canceled checks were filed carefully in chronological order, each one representing a chunk of Hank's savings, money he had earned through brutal hours of labor under the Nebraska sun. And then there were the gifts. Every year on Diane's birthday, March 15th, a package would arrive at her address. Not expensive things, a book of poetry, a hand-knit scarf in colors Hank somehow knew she favored, packets of wildflower seeds, a silver bracelet with a small heart charm, each accompanied by a card that said only, "From a friend who wishes you well." The receipts for these items were saved, along with drafts of the cards in his grandfather's careful handwriting, notes scribbled and crossed out and rubricated until the message achieved exactly the right tone of distant warmth. Caleb carried his coffee out to the porch and sat on the steps, where he had sat countless times before, watching the day gather itself. The storm had left the world refreshed and gleaming, but it had also left damage. He could see where sections of fence had blown down near the north pasture. Several shingles were missing from the barn roof, and when he walked out to check on old Ben, he found that the scarecrow's wooden support post had cracked nearly through, leaving the whole structure listing dangerously to one side. He knelt in the damp earth beside the scarecrow and examined the damage. The post had been in the ground for decades, long enough for the wood to rot at the base where water collected. It would need to be replaced entirely, which meant digging out the old post and resetting a new one, a job that would take the better part of a morning. But when he started to dig, his shovel hit something solid about 2 feet down. At first he thought it was a rock, one of the limestone chunks that turned up frequently in this soil. But when he cleared away the dirt, he found metal, a basso of some kind, wrapped in layers of plastic garbage bags that had mostly disintegrated with time and moisture. His heart began to hammer in his chest even before he understood why. Some instinct told him this was not random, not forgotten, not accidental. He pulled the box free and carried it back to the porch where the light was better. The plastic came away in brittle sheets. Beneath was an old ammunition can, military surplus from the look of it, the kind of waterproof container meant to keep things safe through any disaster. It was secured with a combination lock rather than a key, and Caleb sat staring at it for a long moment before trying the obvious. His birthday, March 15th. The date his parents died and he came to live here. The date his grandfather had chosen as the combination for the lock on his desk drawer. The lock clicked open on the first try. Inside was a single item, a photograph album, its leather cover water-stained but intact, its pages protected by the watertight seal of the ammunition can. Caleb opened it with hands that had started trembling again, and found himself looking at images he had never seen before. The first page held a picture of a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, standing in front of a white clapboard church. She wore a simple cotton dress, and her dark hair was pulled back in a style from another era. Her smile was radiant, transforming an otherwise ordinary face into something luminous. On the back, someone had written in careful script, "Evelyn Shaw, summer 1963." The woman who would become his grandmother, the woman his grandfather had loved, captured in a moment of uncomplicated joy. The next pages showed Evelyn and Hank together, picnicking by a lake, dancing at what looked like a county fair, sitting on the porch of this very house, younger versions of themselves, arms around each other, faces turned toward a future they believed stretched out endlessly before them. In every image, they looked at each other with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable to witness, as if they were the only two people in the world, and that was exactly how they wanted it. Then came the pregnancy photos. Evelyn in profile, her belly swelling beneath a maternity dress, Evelyn sitting in a rocking chair, hands resting on her stomach, expression serene despite what Caleb now knew she must have known, that she was dying, that the child growing inside her was being nourished by a body that was simultaneously being consumed by cancer, that she would never see her daughter grow up. And finally, at the end of the album, a single photograph that stopped his breath in his throat. A hospital room, harsh fluorescent light, clinical white walls. Evelyn propped up in bed, impossibly thin, her face gaunt but her eyes bright. In her arms, wrapped in a pink blanket, a newborn baby. And standing beside the bed, one hand on Evelyn's shoulder, looking down at them both with an expression of such devastating tenderness that Caleb had to look away. His grandfather. Young Hank Brennan at 23, before grief had carved lines into his face, before silence had become his native language, before the weight of 60 years of secret sorrow had bent his shoulders. Someone else had taken this picture. A nurse probably, or another family member. It was slightly out of focus, the composition imperfect, but it captured a moment of absolute truth. A family, complete for the only time it would ever be complete. Three people who should have had a lifetime together, frozen in the instant before everything shattered. Caleb sat on the porch steps with the album in his lap and wept for the third time in 24 hours. He wept for Evelyn, who had died so young. He wept for the baby who became Diane, who never knew her mother. He wept for his grandfather, who had lived 6 decades with this grief. And he wept for himself, for the sudden, overwhelming understanding that love was not always enough, that sometimes the best you could do was insufficient, that life dealt hands so cruel there was no right way to play them. When he could see clearly again, he went back inside and found the address book in his grandfather's desk. Michael Price was listed there with a phone number and a notation. Trusted friend, postal route 7. Caleb dialed the number and waited through 4 rings before a man's voice answered. Price residence. Mr. Price, my name is Caleb Brennan. I'm Hank Brennan's grandson. There was a long pause. Then I wondered when you would call. I figured Hank must have left something for you to find. He left journals, financial records, and a photograph album buried under the scarecrow. Old Ben. Another pause. That was Hank, always putting things where they meant something. You planning to find her? Diane, yes, I need to. She deserves to know. Michael's voice was steady, certain. Your grandfather loved that girl every day of his life. She should understand that. Can you help me? I need to know where she is, how to approach her without scaring her off. I can do better than that. I can tell you who she is. Over the next hour, Michael Price told Caleb everything. He had been Hank's only confidant for nearly 50 years, the one person the old man trusted with the truth. As a postal worker, Michael had been perfectly positioned to mail the annual birthday gifts without raising questions. But more than that, he had been a friend in the truest sense, someone who listened without judging, who helped without asking for explanations, who kept secrets that were not his own. Diane Rachel Thornton lived in a modest house in a quiet Des Moines neighborhood. She had retired 2 years ago after a long career as a pediatric nurse at Mercy Medical Center. Her husband Bob had died 5 years back, leaving her a widow with 2 grown sons, Marcus and Simon, and 3 grandchildren. She volunteered at a local literacy center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. She went to the same grocery store every Saturday morning. She had been searching for information about her birth parents for at least 30 years that Michael knew of, maybe longer. She came here once, Michael said quietly, to Hastings. It was about 20 years ago, maybe a little more. Hank called me in a panic, said there was a strange car parked at the end of his driveway, and he recognized the woman sitting in it from the photos he had. She sat there for maybe 45 minutes. Hank stood at the window the whole time, just watching her. You were out in the yard playing, just a little kid, 7, 8 years old. And finally she drove away. Hank said it was the hardest thing he ever did, not running out there. But you were there, and he thought, how do I explain this boy to her? How do I tell her I chose to raise my grandson instead of reaching out to my daughter? Caleb closed his eyes and saw it. His grandfather at the window, watching his daughter work up the courage to knock on the door. And out in the yard, oblivious to the drama unfolding around him, a young Caleb doing whatever children do, secure in the knowledge that he was wanted here, that he belonged. His grandfather had made a choice in that moment, had chosen, for the second time in Diane's life, to remain hidden. I need to see where he went, Caleb said. The places he watched her from. Can you show me? Michael was silent for a moment. You sure you want to do that? It might be harder than you think. I'm sure. They met in Des Moines 2 days later. Michael Price turned out to be a compact man in his middle 50s, with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who had spent years walking outdoor routes in all weather. He shook Caleb's hand with a grip that was firm but not aggressive, and his eyes held a sadness that suggested he understood exactly what kind of journey this was going to be. First stop was the house where Diane lived, a neat bungalow with a well-tended garden and a porch swing that looked like it got regular use. Michael parked 3 houses down on the opposite side of the street, the same spot Hank had used during his monthly visits. He would sit here for an hour, sometimes 2, Michael said, just watching the house. Sometimes she would come out to water the flowers or collect the mail. Sometimes one of her boys would show up with the grandkids. Hank kept a notebook where he wrote down everything he saw, what she was wearing, whether she looked happy or tired, what the weather was like that day. He said it helped him feel connected. They sat in silence for a few minutes. Caleb watched the house and tried to imagine his grandfather doing the same, month after month, year after year. The patience it must have required, the discipline, the profound loneliness of loving someone from such distance. Next, they drove to Miller's Bakery on Ingersoll Avenue, though the bakery itself had closed years ago and was now an insurance office. This is where she worked part-time when she was 16, Michael explained. Your grandfather came here once, just once. He went inside and ordered coffee. She served him. They had maybe a 3-minute conversation about nothing. Cream and sugar, the weather, whether the cinnamon rolls were fresh, and then he left and never came back. He told me later it was simultaneously the best and worst 8 minutes of his life. Caleb stood on the sidewalk looking at the building and felt something crack open in his chest. He pictured a teenage Diane behind a counter, smiling at customers, unaware that one of them was her father. And he pictured Hank, working up the courage just to walk through the door, to be in the same room with his daughter, to hear her voice directed at him even if she did not know who he was. They went to Mercy Medical Center, where Diane had worked for 30 years, to the community college where she had earned her nursing degree, funded by the Evelyn Shaw Memorial Scholarship that Hank had established, to the church where she had married Bob Thornton while Hank watched from the back row, to the cemetery where Bob was buried and where, according to Michael, Hank had stood at a distance during the funeral, grieving for the widowed daughter he could not comfort. The last stop was Hoyt Park on the north side of the city. Michael led him to a bench under an oak tree with a view of the playground. Diane brings her grandkids here most Sundays when the weather's nice, he said. Your grandfather would come and sit on this bench. He would watch her push the kids on the swings or help them down the slide. He said it was the closest he could get to being part of her life, watching her be a grandmother, seeing the joy on her face when the little ones laughed. Caleb sat on the bench and looked out at the playground equipment, the swing swaying slightly in the breeze, the slide gleaming in the afternoon sun. How many Sunday afternoons had his grandfather spent here, this solitary old man on a bench, watching a family that did not know he existed? The other people in the park would have seen nothing unusual. Just another retiree enjoying the day, no different from dozens of others. They could not have known they were witnessing an act of devotion so pure and so painful that it defied easy categorization. I have something else to show you, Michael said, back at my place. Michael's house was a small ranch style in a neighborhood of similar houses, all of them modest and well-maintained. Inside was neat to the point of spareness, the home of a man who lived alone and liked it that way. But in the spare bedroom that served as an office, Michael opened a filing cabinet and pulled out a box. Your grandfather gave me these over the years, he said, asked me to hold on to them in case something happened to him. I think he always knew that eventually someone would need to understand. The box contained letters, hundreds of them, arranged in bundles tied with string, organized by year. All of them were addressed to Diane. All of them were sealed but never sent. Caleb opened one at random, postmarked from 1989. Dear Diane, it began in his grandfather's familiar script. You turned 25 today, a quarter of a century since I last held you. I saw in the newspaper that you passed your nursing boards with high marks. I am not surprised. Your mother was the smartest person I ever knew, and you have her mind as surely as you have her eyes. I wish I could tell you that. I wish I could tell you so many things, but I made my choice a long time ago, and I have to live with it. Just know that somewhere in Nebraska there is an old farmer who thinks about you every single day and is proud of the woman you have become. Your father, Hank. Caleb read letter after letter, moving through the years of Diane's life as seen through her father's eyes. Celebrations and sorrows, triumphs and setbacks, all witnessed from afar and recorded in these letters that were never mailed. It was like reading a one-sided conversation that had lasted 6 decades, a monologue of love directed at someone who did not know she was being addressed. Why didn't he send them, Caleb asked, even just once? Michael shook his head. He said it wouldn't be fair, that she had a life, a family, a sense of who she was, that showing up after all those years would just cause confusion and pain. He convinced himself that loving her meant letting her be happy without him. But she was looking for him. You said she had been searching. For her birth parents, yes. But she didn't know what she would find. Your grandfather worried that the reality would be disappointing, that he would be disappointing. A poor farmer with nothing to offer but excuses and regrets. He thought it was better to remain unknown than to be known and found wanting. That night in a hotel room in Des Moines, Caleb could not sleep. He lay in the dark and thought about everything he had learned. The scholarship fund, the paid mortgage, the bakery job saved from closure. His grandfather had not just watched Diane's life unfold. He had shaped it gently and invisibly, clearing obstacles from her path, creating opportunities she thought were random chance. He had been a father to her in the only way he knew how, through action rather than presence, through sacrifice that demanded no recognition. And what had it cost him? 60 years of silence, 60 years of walking through the world with a hole in his heart that nothing could fill. Even when Caleb came to live with him, even when he threw himself into the work of raising a traumatized orphan, there must have been moments when he thought about the daughter he had given away. Moments when the weight of it crushed him. Caleb pulled out his phone and searched for Diane Rachel Thornton, found her Facebook page with its privacy settings that allowed him to see just the profile picture. A woman of 60 with silver-streaked dark hair and blue eyes that were achingly familiar because they were his grandfather's eyes. She was smiling in the photo, standing with two younger men who had to be her sons, and her expression was one of contentment. She looked, Caleb thought, like someone who had built a good life despite not having all the answers she wanted. He drafted and deleted a dozen messages before finally settling on something simple. Mrs. Thornton, my name is Caleb Brennan. I am the grandson of Henry Hank Brennan, who passed away 3 months ago. While settling his estate, I have discovered information that I believe concerns you. Would you be willing to meet with me to discuss this? I understand this is unusual, and I apologize for contacting you out of the blue, but I think you will find what I have to share is important. He sent it before he could overthink it further, then set the phone on the nightstand and stared at the ceiling. Either she would respond or she would not. Either she would be willing to hear the truth or she would want nothing to do with the stranger claiming a connection to her unknown past. All he could do was wait. The response came 16 hours later. Mr. Brennan, I have been searching for information about my birth father for most of my adult life. If you have something that can help me understand where I came from, I am willing to meet. But I need to know this is legitimate. What proof do you have? Caleb photographed his grandfather's desk drawer, showing the birth certificate with Diane's tiny footprints and Hank's signature on the line marked father. He photographed one of the journals, open to an entry from her wedding day. He photographed the hospital picture of Evelyn holding newborn Diane while Hank stood beside them. And he sent them all with a single message. I have 60 years worth of proof. Whenever you are ready, I will show you everything. Her response was immediate. Tomorrow, 2 o'clock. There is a coffee shop called Java House on Ingersoll. I will be there. Caleb lay awake most of that night too, rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain. But when he finally met Diane the next afternoon, sitting across from her at a small table in the corner of the coffee shop, all his prepared words evaporated. Up close, she looked even more like his grandfather. The shape of her face, the set of her shoulders, the way she held her coffee cup with both hands as if drawing warmth from it. You have his eyes, she said before he could speak. I saw it in the photo you sent, the same eyes looking back at me. You have them too. She nodded slowly. I know. I used to wonder if that was one reason the Thorntons chose me, because I looked like I could be their daughter. But I never quite fit, you know? I was always just slightly different. Now I understand why. Caleb opened the leather portfolio he had brought and slid the birth certificate across the table. She picked it up with trembling hands and read it 3 times, her lips moving silently. When she set it down, her eyes were wet. Evelyn Grace Shaw, she said. That was my mother's name. Yes. She died when you were 3 days old, ovarian cancer. She refused treatment during the pregnancy because it might have hurt you. Diane pressed her fingers to her mouth. I did not know that. The Thorntons told me my birth mother died shortly after I was born, but they did not have details. They said the adoption was arranged privately through their doctor and that records were sealed. Your father, Hank, my grandfather, he wanted you to have a better life than he could give you. So he gave you to a couple who could provide everything he could not. But he never stopped loving you. He never stopped watching over you. Over the next 2 hours, Caleb told her everything. Showed her the journals, the letters, the photographs. explained about the scholarship fund and the mortgage and the bakery and all the ways Hank had invisibly supported her through the years. Diane listened without speaking, absorbing each revelation with visible effort. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes she laughed, a sound that held no humor. Sometimes she just sat very still, looking at images of a man she had never met, who had nevertheless been present at every important moment of her life. When Caleb finished, when all the evidence was spread across the table between them, Diane picked up the hospital photograph. The one showing Evelyn and newborn Diane and young Hank, the family that existed for only a moment. "He was there," she said softly. "At my wedding, I felt someone watching me and I turned around and there was this older man in the back row. I thought he looked sad. Then I turned back to Bob and when I looked again, the man was gone." "That was him, wasn't it?" "Yes. According to his journal, he left before the ceremony ended because he could not bear to watch you promise yourself to someone else when he had never been able to claim you as his own." Diane set the photo down and covered her face with her hands. Her shoulders shook, but she made no sound. Caleb waited, giving her the space to process, to grieve, to rage if she needed to. When she finally looked up, her face was blotchy and her eyes were red, but her expression was clear. "I am so angry," she said, "not at him, at the universe, at fate, at whatever forces kept us apart when we should have known each other. I spent 40 years looking for him, and he was only 90 miles away. 90 miles. I could have driven there any time. I could have knocked on his door, and he would have opened it, wouldn't he?" "I think so. Yes, especially in the last few years. I think he was trying to work up the courage. But he ran out of time. We both did." They sat in silence as the coffee shop filled and emptied around them, as the afternoon light shifted and changed, as the weight of all those lost years settled between them like something solid and immovable. Finally, Diane reached across the table and took Caleb's hand. "Thank you," she said, "for finding me, for telling me, for giving me this even though it hurts. I need to see the farm, the place where I was born, where my mother lived, where my father spent his whole life thinking about me. Will you take me there?" Caleb nodded, unable to speak past the lump in his throat. They agreed to make the drive the following weekend. 5 days that would give Diane time to read through the journals, to absorb the reality of her father's secret devotion, to decide how she felt about a man who loved her enough to let her go and not enough to call her back. As they parted outside the coffee shop, Diane hugged him. It was brief and awkward, the embrace of two people who were family but also strangers. But in that moment, Caleb felt something shift, some weight he had been carrying without knowing it lifting slightly. His grandfather's story was no longer a secret locked away in journals and buried boxes. It was out in the light now, being witnessed and understood. And though Hank Brennan could never know that his daughter had finally learned the truth, Caleb chose to believe that somehow, wherever he was, the old man was at peace. The 5 days between the coffee shop meeting and the agreed visit to the farm stretched out like a held breath. Caleb spent them preparing the house, though he was not entirely sure what he was preparing it for. He cleaned rooms that had not been cleaned since before his grandfather died, swept away cobwebs and dust, aired out the mustiness that accumulates in places where no one lives. He mowed the lawn and trimmed the hedges and fixed the loose board on the front step that had been loose for as long as he could remember. He told himself he was just being a responsible caretaker, but the truth was simpler and more complicated. He was making the house ready to be seen by someone who had every right to see it, but never had. In Des Moines, Diane spent those same 5 days reading. Caleb had left her with 3 of the journals, the ones that covered her childhood and adolescence, and she worked through them methodically. A nurse's training applied to the dissection of her own past. Her sons Marcus and Simon noticed the change in her immediately, the way she moved through the house with a distracted air, the way she would stop sometimes in the middle of a task and just stand there, looking at nothing, her face carrying an expression they had never seen before. On the Wednesday evening, Marcus came to her house and found her sitting at the kitchen table with one of the journals open in front of her and tears running silently down her face. He had seen his mother cry before, at his father's funeral, and when his own son was born 3 months premature, and when the world delivered the kind of blows that break through even the strongest defenses. But this was different. This was not the crying of grief or fear or even joy. This was something else entirely. "Mom," he said, sitting down across from her, talk to me." She looked up as if surprised to find him there, as if she had forgotten there was anyone else in the world. Then she turned the journal around so he could see the page. June 19th, 1984, his grandfather's handwriting read, "Diane graduated from nursing school today." I sat in the back row of the auditorium and watched her walk across that stage to receive her diploma. When they called her name and she stepped forward, I stood up without thinking. Started to clap. Then I realized what I was doing and sat back down. But for just that moment, I was not a stranger hiding in the crowd. I was a father watching his daughter achieve something remarkable. And it was the proudest moment of my life. Marcus read it twice. "Who wrote this?" "My father." Diane's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she touched the page. "The man who gave me up for adoption when I was 3 days old, and then spent the next 60 years watching me from a distance. He was at my graduation. He was at my wedding. He paid for my education without me knowing. He saved your grandparents from losing their house when I was 14. And I never knew. I never had any idea he existed." Over the next hour, she told Marcus everything, showed him the photographs and the birth certificate and the letters that had never been sent. She watched her son's face cycle through confusion and disbelief, and finally a kind of awed comprehension. When she finished, he sat back in his chair and let out a long, slow breath. "That is the saddest thing I have ever heard," he said, "and also maybe the most beautiful. I do not know how to feel about it." Diane folded her hands on top of the journal as if to keep it from escaping. "Part of me is so angry I could scream. He had no right to make that decision for both of us, to decide that I was better off not knowing him. But another part understands. He was young and alone and terrified, and he thought he was doing the right thing. Are you going to the farm? Saturday. Caleb is going to show me where I was born, where my mother lived before she died, where my father spent his entire life loving me from 90 miles away. Do you want me to come with you?" Diane considered this, then shook her head. "No, this is something I need to do alone. Well, not alone, with Caleb. He has family too. Even though we just met, my nephew, my father's grandson, the boy my father chose to raise when he could not raise me." Marcus reached across the table and took his mother's hand. "Dad would want you to do this," he said. "Bob, I mean, he always told you to find your birth parents if you could. He said everyone deserves to know where they come from. Your father was a good man. He was. And so was this other man, apparently. Your biological father. Hank." Marcus tested the name, trying it out. He sounds like he was a good man too. Just a man who made an impossible choice and lived with it the only way he knew how. After Marcus left, Diane returned to the journals. She read through the night and into the early morning, following her life as seen through her father's eyes. The entries were not daily, but they were frequent. Moments of observation and reflection that added up to a portrait of devotion that was almost overwhelming in its constancy. He had known when she got her driver's license, and when she had her wisdom teeth removed, and when she broke up with her high school boyfriend. He had known about the miscarriage she suffered between Marcus and Simon, something she had told very few people. He had known because he was always watching, always paying attention, always loving her from that unbridgeable distance. And woven through all of it was his love for Evelyn. References to things she had said or done, to the way she had smiled or laughed, to her courage in the face of death. He had never remarried, never even dated as far as Diane could tell from the journals. His heart had been given to Evelyn when he was barely more than a boy, and when she died, she had taken some essential part of him with her, leaving behind only enough to keep functioning, to keep working, to keep watching over the daughter they had created together. On Saturday morning, Diane woke early and dressed carefully, choosing clothes that felt right for visiting a farm. Jeans and a simple blouse and practical shoes. She looked at herself in the mirror and tried to see what her father had seen when he looked at her from across a bakery counter or from the back row of an auditorium. Did she resemble Evelyn? The photographs suggested she did around the eyes and mouth, but the rest was pure Brennan, the strong jaw and broad shoulders, and that particular way of holding herself that she had noticed in the pictures of Hank. The drive to Hastings took just over an hour and a half, and for most of it, Diane watched the landscape change from city to suburb to farmland, from the developed world to the great open spaces that still define the American heartland. She had made this drive before, of course, had passed through this part of Nebraska on her way to other places. But she had never known that just off one of these highways, down one of these gravel roads, was the place where her story had begun. Caleb was waiting on the porch when she pulled up the long driveway, and he raised one hand in greeting as she parked beside his truck. She sat in the car for a moment, looking at the house, white clapboard gone gray with age. A porch that sagged slightly, windows that needed washing. It was exactly the kind of house she had imagined when she thought about her unknown origins, solid and unpretentious and worn down by time and weather and the endless work of farming. "Welcome," Caleb said as she got out of the car. "Welcome home" might be more accurate, but I was not sure if that would sound strange. "It sounds perfect." Diane looked around, taking in the barn and the outbuildings and the vast cornfield that stretched away to the east. "This is where I was born?" "In that bedroom right there." Caleb pointed to a window on the second floor. "Your mother insisted on having you at home, even though the doctor wanted her in the hospital. She said she wanted you to be born in the house where you would grow up. She did not know yet that things would not work out that way." They went inside and Diane moved through the room slowly, touching things, trying to imagine the people who had lived here. The kitchen where Evelyn must have cooked meals and washed dishes and planned for a future that would never arrive. The living room where Hank had sat every evening, looking out the window at the cornfield, thinking thoughts he shared with no one. The bedroom upstairs with its simple furniture and the window that looked out over the land. "She was born right here," Caleb said, standing in the doorway. "There was a midwife and a doctor on standby in case something went wrong. But your mother was strong. You came into the world at 6:23 in the morning on March 15th, 7 pounds, 4 ounces. Your father wrote in his journal that you had the loudest cry he had ever heard. He said it was the most beautiful sound in the world." Diane sat on the edge of the bed and tried to imagine it. Her mother laboring in this room, her father pacing anxiously, the moment when she emerged into the light and air and the loving hands that waited to receive her. 3 days later, Evelyn would be dead and the trajectory of Diane's life would change irrevocably. But for those 3 days, they had been a family, complete and whole, and no one could take that away. "Can I see the rest?" she asked. Caleb showed her everything. The attic where he had found the hidden journals. The desk drawer where the financial records had been kept. The closet with its secret door leading to the crawl space where decades of memories had been stored like treasure. And finally, he led her outside to where old Ben stood at his post near the fence line, leaning at an angle now that his support post had cracked. "This is where I found the photograph album," Caleb said, "buried right here under the scarecrow. My grandfather had a thing about putting important items in places that meant something. Old Ben has been standing guard over this field for as long as I can remember. Longer than that, probably. It makes sense that he would bury the pictures here." Diane stood looking at the scarecrow, this crude assemblage of wood and straw that had marked the spot where her origin story lay hidden for 6 decades. There was something almost sacred about it, this weathered sentinel keeping watch over secrets it could never reveal. "I want to see where my mother is buried," she said. They drove to the cemetery on the edge of Hastings, a small plot of land behind the Methodist church where generations of local families had been laid to rest. Hank's grave was easy to find, the earth still mounded and the headstone simple. Henry Thomas Brennan, 1941 to 2024. Beloved grandfather. Next to it was an older grave with a headstone that read Evelyn Grace Shaw, 1943 to 1964. Beloved daughter and mother. And between them, a space just wide enough for one more. "He saved this spot," Caleb said quietly. "For Diane, for you, in case you wanted to be buried here with your parents someday." Diane knelt in the grass between the two graves and placed one hand on each headstone. The stone was warm from the sun, and she closed her eyes and tried to feel some connection to these two people who had given her life and then exited from it so quickly. Her mother, who she had never known. Her father, who had known her only from afar. "I forgive you," she said, and she was not sure which of them she was addressing. Maybe both. "I forgive you for dying. I forgive you for leaving. I forgive you for the choices you made that kept us apart. I understand now that you did what you thought was right, and I choose to believe that you loved me, both of you, in your own ways." She stayed there for a long time, kneeling in the grass, while Caleb stood at a respectful distance and let her have this moment of communion with the dead. When she finally stood, her knees were damp from the earth and her face was wet, but she was smiling. They went back to the farm and sat on the porch as the afternoon sun slanted across the cornfield, and Diane began to talk. She told Caleb about her childhood with the Thorntons, about Bob and Ellen, who had been good parents, even if they were not her biological ones. She told him about the vague sense of otherness she had always felt, the knowledge that she was loved, but also that there was something missing, some piece of herself she could not quite locate. She told him about the first time she tried to find information about her birth parents, when she was 22 and newly married, and how the sealed adoption records had blocked her at every turn. I came here once, Shaw said, about 20 years ago. I had hired a private investigator, and he traced my birth certificate to this county. He could not find out much more than that, but he gave me this address. So I drove out here one Saturday and parked at the end of the driveway. I sat in my car for almost an hour trying to work up the courage to knock on the door. Caleb felt his chest tighten. My grandfather wrote about that day in his journal. He saw you from the window. He said it was the hardest thing he ever did, not running out to you. Why did he not? I was here. I was 7 years old and playing in the yard. He had just taken me in 2 years before after my parents died, and I think he was afraid. Afraid of how to explain me to you. Afraid of disrupting the life you had built. Afraid that if he opened that door, everything would change in ways he could not control. Diane was quiet for a moment. I saw a little boy playing. I remember thinking how happy he looked, how safe, and I thought, if I go up there and knock on that door and demand answers, maybe I will destroy that. So I drove away. I told myself it was for the best, that some questions are better left unanswered. But they are not better left unanswered. Are they? No, they are not. As the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb brought out the final piece of evidence he had been saving. It was a letter written on yellow legal paper in his grandfather's hand, dated just 2 weeks before he died. It was addressed to Diane, and it had been in the locked drawer of Hank's desk, waiting. He wanted you to have this, Caleb said. After he was gone, I think he knew he would never find the courage to give it to you himself. Diane took the letter with trembling hands and unfolded it carefully. The paper was creased and worn, suggesting it had been folded and unfolded many times, read and reread by the man who wrote it. She began to read aloud, her voice catching on certain words but pushing through. My dearest Diane, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my grandson Caleb has found you and told you the truth. I have written this letter 100 times in my head over the years, but I could never quite get the words right. How do you explain 60 years of silence? How do you ask forgiveness for an absence that defined both our lives? I want you to know that giving you to the Thorntons was the hardest decision I ever made. Your mother, Evelyn, died 3 days after you were born. She held you for a total of perhaps 20 minutes before the cancer and the trauma of childbirth took her from us. In those last lucid moments, she made me promise that I would raise you, that I would tell you about her, that I would give you all the love she could not. And I broke that promise. I broke it because I was young and scared, and because I truly believed you deserved better than what I could provide. A motherless child raised by a 23-year-old farmer who could barely keep himself together, let alone a baby. The Thorntons could give you everything: a mother and a father, stability, opportunity, love. But I never stopped loving you. I need you to understand that. Every day of my life I thought about you. Every milestone, every achievement, every moment of joy or pain in your life, I was there in spirit, even if I could not be there in body. I followed your progress through the years. I helped when I could in ways you would never know. The scholarship that paid for your nursing school, the mortgage payment that saved the Thorntons from foreclosure, the job at the bakery that stayed open because someone bought out the failing owner. That was all me. It was the only way I knew how to be a father to you, from a distance, in secret, with a love so fierce it consumed me. You have every right to be angry. You have every right to hate me for what I did. But I want you to know that my silence was never about not caring. It was about caring too much, about loving you so completely that I was willing to sacrifice any relationship with you so that you could have the life you deserved. I hope you have been happy. I hope the Thorntons gave you the childhood I could not. I hope you found love and built a family and made a difference in the world. From what I have observed, you did all those things and more. You became a nurse, a healer, someone who dedicates their life to caring for others. Your mother would be so proud. I am so proud. I am sorry I never had the courage to tell you this while I was alive. I am sorry for every missed moment, every conversation we never had, every hug I never got to give you. But I am not sorry for loving you. That is the one thing I got right. I loved you from the moment you were born until the moment I died. And if there is anything beyond this life, I will love you there too. Your father, Hank Brennan. When Diane finished reading, the letter fell from her hands and she covered her face and wept. Not the quiet tears she had shed at the cemetery, but deep, wrenching sobs that came from someplace far inside her that had been locked away for 60 years. Caleb sat beside her and put his arm around her shoulders and let her cry, offering the only comfort he could, which was his presence and his understanding. Eventually, the crying subsided, and Diane wiped her face with her hands and picked up the letter again, folding it carefully and holding it against her chest. He loved me, she said. All this time, he loved me. Yes, and my mother, Evelyn. She wanted me. More than anything. They sat in silence as the last of the daylight faded and the stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the cornfield, a nighthawk called, and from the distance came the faint sound of traffic on the highway. The world continued its indifferent turning, but here on this porch, two people who were strangers a week ago and family forever sat together and mourned for what had been lost and celebrated what had been found. I want to do something, Diane said finally. I want to honor them, my mother and my father, not just with tears and regret, but with something real, something that lasts. What did you have in mind? I do not know yet, but there has to be a way to turn all this pain into something good, to make sure their story, their love, their sacrifice means something beyond just the two of us knowing about it. Caleb thought about this. The farm is yours too, he said, half of it legally according to the will. My grandfather left it to both of us. I think he always intended for us to find each other, for you to have a claim on this place. I do not want to take it from you. This is your home. It is your home too. You were born here. Your parents loved each other here. Your father spent his whole life here thinking about you. If anyone has a right to this land, it is you. Diane looked out at the dark field, at the place where she had entered the world and where her father had spent 6 decades tending the earth and nurturing a love that had nowhere to go. Then maybe we share it, she said. Maybe we find a way to keep it in the family, but use it for something that would make them proud. Like what? I need to think about it, but there has to be something. Some way to help people who are in the situations my parents were in. Young single parents who are scared and alone. Families facing medical crises. Children who need homes. There has to be a way to take what they went through and use it to ease someone else's burden. They talked late into the night, sitting on that porch, throwing out ideas and discarding them and building on each other's thoughts. And slowly, gradually, the shape of something began to emerge. Not a plan exactly, not yet, but a vision, a possibility, a way forward that honored the past without being trapped by it. When Diane finally left, promising to return soon, Caleb stood on the porch and watched her taillights disappear down the driveway. The house felt different now, less like a museum of grief and more like a bridge between past and future. His grandfather was still gone. Evelyn was still gone. 60 years of separation could not be undone. But something new was beginning. Something his grandfather might never have imagined, but would have recognized instantly as the natural consequence of the seeds he had planted. Love, it turned out, did not disappear when it went unexpressed. It went underground, it waited. It grew in the dark. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very patient, it broke through into the light at last, changed but still recognizably itself, ready to bloom in ways the gardener never lived to see. Caleb went inside and sat at the kitchen table with the journal spread before him. He opened the most recent one to the last entry his grandfather had made, 2 days before the cancer took him. It was short, just a few lines. I am dying and I am afraid, not of death itself, but of dying without her knowing. Without Diane understanding that she was loved every single day of her life by a father who was too broken to show it properly. Caleb will find the journals. Caleb will find her. And maybe, if I am very fortunate, she will understand. She will forgive. And she will know that love, real love, is not always about being together. Sometimes it is about letting go, about sacrifice, about doing what is right even when it tears you apart. I loved you, Diane. I love you still. And I am sorry. So very sorry. Caleb closed the journal and sat in the quiet house. Outside, old Ben stood watch over the field, leaning but not yet fallen, keeping faith with his post, even as the wood rotted and the straw scattered. Tomorrow Caleb would fix him, would reset the post and make him straight again. But tonight he would just sit here and be grateful. Grateful for grandfathers who loved in silence. Grateful for daughters who forgave impossible absences. Grateful for the strange and painful ways that families found each other across the years and the miles in the chasms of misunderstanding. And grateful most of all for this, that stories, even sad ones, even ones that seemed to end in separation and regret, sometimes found a way to continue, to surprise you, to offer one more chapter when you thought the book was closed. His grandfather's story was not over. It was changing, evolving, becoming something new. And Caleb, who had thought he was just cleaning out an old man's house, found himself in the middle of it, a keeper of promises he had not known were made, a bridge between the past that was and the future that was still being written. The week after Diane's visit to the farm, Caleb found himself unable to settle. He moved through the house like a ghost, picking up objects and setting them down again, starting tasks and abandoning them half-finished. The place felt different now that someone else knew its secrets, now that the story hidden in its walls had been shared. It was as if the house itself was exhaling after holding its breath for 60 years. And in that exhalation, something fundamental had shifted. He kept returning to his grandfather's bedroom, to the closet with its hidden door, and the crawl space beyond where the journals had waited in the dark. There had to be more. His grandfather had been too meticulous, too thorough in his documentation, for the journals to be the whole story. So Caleb searched with a patience he had learned from the old man himself, methodical and unhurried, trusting that if there was something to find, it would reveal itself when the time was right. On Thursday afternoon, while going through a box of old tax returns, he found it. Tucked between forms from 1972 and 1973 was a manila envelope, unsealed, containing what appeared to be medical records. He pulled them out carefully, and the letterhead made his stomach tighten. Hastings Psychiatric Associates. Patient, Henry T. Brennan. The dates range from 1966 to 1974, a period of 8 years that corresponded with the time between Evelyn's death and when his grandfather seemed, based on the journal entries, to have found some measure of equilibrium. The records painted a portrait of a young man drowning. Diagnosis: major depressive disorder with suicidal ideation. 2 hospitalizations, one in 1966 lasting 3 weeks and another in 1972 lasting 5 days. Multiple medication trials. Weekly therapy sessions that his grandfather had driven 40 miles each way to attend, never telling anyone where he was going, carrying this burden in the same silence he carried everything else. But it was the therapist's notes that truly shattered him. Session dated April 12, 1967. Patient continues to express belief that he made the correct decision in relinquishing custody of his daughter, but this belief provides no emotional relief. States he fears the child has inherited his depressive tendencies and that he saved her from a life of mental illness by giving her to a stable family. When confronted with the illogic of this belief, Patient becomes agitated. He insists his father's suicide in 1947 and his own struggles prove a genetic curse that must not be passed on. I have attempted to explain that depression, while having genetic components, is not destiny, but Patient remains unconvinced. Further down, session dated November 3, 1972. Patient was hospitalized last week following a suicide attempt. He had tied a rope to a barn rafter, but was discovered by a neighbor before he could complete the act. Patient states he no longer wishes to die, but struggles with the weight of his decision regarding his daughter. He says, quote, "I see her in my dreams. She asked me why I left her. I have no answer that makes sense, not even to myself," end quote. We discussed coping strategies and the importance of medication compliance. Caleb sat on the floor of his grandfather's bedroom with the medical records spread around him and felt something crack open in his chest. The man he had known, the taciturn farmer who rose before dawn and worked until dark and spoke mostly in grunts and single syllables, had been fighting a war inside himself every day. A war between the choice he had made and the love he could not extinguish. A war between staying alive and giving into the darkness that apparently ran in his bloodline like a curse. And he had never told anyone. Not the neighbors who must have gossiped when he was hospitalized, not the friends who might have offered support, and certainly not Caleb, who had lived with him for 15 years and never suspected that beneath the old man's stoic exterior lay this much pain. His phone rang, and he answered it without looking, still too shaken to pay attention. Caleb? It was Diane's voice, tentative. Is this a bad time? Number? Yes, I do not know. He rubbed his face with his free hand. I just found something. Medical records. From a psychiatrist. He heard her sharp intake of breath. Tell me. So he did. He read her sections of the therapist's notes, the diagnoses, the descriptions of a man barely holding on. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. He thought I would inherit it, she said finally. His depression, that is why he gave me away. He thought he was saving me from myself. It seems that way, but I did not inherit it. Diane's voice was thick with emotion. I have been happy, Caleb. Not every day, not every moment, but overall my life has been good. I did not get his darkness. I got Evelyn's strength instead. Maybe he never knew that. Maybe he spent 60 years believing he had done the right thing and hating himself for it anyway. That makes it worse somehow. Not better. Worse. They were both quieter for a moment, absorbing this new dimension of Hank's sacrifice. He had not just given Diane away because he was poor or young or overwhelmed. He had given her away because he believed deeply and with the certainty of the depressed mind that he was poison, that his very presence in her life would contaminate her, drag her down into the same darkness that had swallowed his father and threatened daily to swallow him. I want to come back, Diane said. To the farm. There is something I need to do, and I think I need to do it there. When? This weekend, if that works for you. And I want to bring my sons, Marcus and Simon. They should see this place. They should understand where they come from. Of course. Caleb looked around the bedroom at the evidence of his grandfather's secret anguish scattered across the floor. I will be here. After they hung up, Caleb continued his search with renewed purpose. If his grandfather had hidden the medical records, what else might be concealed in this house? He worked through the evening and into the night, checking every drawer and box and cabinet, and in the back of the linen closet on a shelf too high for casual reaching, he found another box. This one was different. It was a decorative box, the kind meant for keeping precious things, covered in faded fabric that might once have been blue. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at his touch, were more photographs. But these were not surveillance images captured from a distance. These were intimate, personal, the kind of photos that told the story of a life that might have been. There was Evelyn in a wedding dress, standing in front of the very church where she was now buried, smiling at the camera with uncomplicated joy. But the date written on the back was June 1963, and Caleb knew from the journals that Hank and Evelyn had never married. This was a photo from before, a photo of what they had planned, what they had hoped for, before cancer rewrote the script. There were more. Evelyn and Hank standing in front of an empty lot with a for sale sign, Evelyn's hand on her still flat belly, a sketch drawn in Evelyn's hand showing the layout of a house they had apparently planned to build, fabric swatches and paint samples paper-clipped to a sheet labeled Baby's Room. A list in Hank's writing, names we like. For a girl, Diane, Rebecca, Catherine. For a boy, Thomas, Michael, James. They had planned it all out. The wedding, the house, the future. And then Evelyn got sick and the future collapsed into a series of increasingly desperate present moments. And by the time Diane was born, the dream had become something else entirely. A tragedy, a burden, a weight too heavy for a grieving young man to carry alone. At the bottom of the box, Caleb found letters. Not the letters Hank had written to Diane over the years, but letters from Evelyn to Hank, written during the months of her illness. He opened one at random and began to read. My dearest Hank, I know the doctors have told you the prognosis. I know you understand that I will not see our daughter grow up. But I need you to promise me something. Promise me you will raise her. Promise me you will tell her about me, about how much I wanted her, about how I would have given anything to stay with her. Promise me you will love her enough for both of us. You are the strongest, kindest man I have ever known, and I know you will be a wonderful father. Do not let grief convince you otherwise. Our daughter will need you, and you will need her. Please, my love, do not let my death rob you of the chance to be her father. That would break my heart more than dying young ever could. All my love, Evelyn. The date on the letter was February 1964, a month before Diane was born. Caleb found another, dated even earlier. Dearest Hank, I am writing this on a good day, one where the pain is manageable and my mind is clear. I want to make sure you have guidance for raising our daughter if I am not here to help. She will need structure, but also freedom. Discipline, but also grace. Teach her to be strong, but make sure she knows it is okay to be soft sometimes too. Read to her every night. Take her to church even if you do not believe. Let her make messes. Let her ask questions. Let her know she is loved unconditionally, not for what she does, but for who she is. And Hank, please take care of yourself too. Grief is a hard master. Do not let it convince you that you are alone or that life is not worth living. You have so much to give our daughter, so much love and wisdom and strength. Do not waste it. Do not throw it away because I had to leave too soon. Promise me. Promise me you will live. Promise me you will be the father I know you can be. Your Evelyn. Caleb sat with these letters until the early morning hours, watching his grandfather's story reshape itself once more. Evelyn had not just asked him to raise their daughter, she had begged him, had laid out a vision of fatherhood that was detailed and loving and full of faith in Hank's ability to do it, and he had failed her. Not through lack of love, but through an excess of fear and self-doubt and the terrible conviction that he would damage his daughter just by being near her. How many times must he have read these letters over the years? How many times must he have held them and wept for promises broken and futures lost? The weight of it was almost unbearable to contemplate. No wonder he had chosen silence. What words could possibly express the magnitude of such regret? When Saturday arrived, Diane came with both her sons and their families in tow. Marcus was tall and serious with his mother's eyes and a lawyer's measured way of speaking. Simon was shorter and more animated, a high school teacher with an easy laugh and a gift for putting people at ease. Marcus brought his wife Jennifer and their 3 children. Simon came with his partners David. All of them spilled out of 2 vehicles and stood in the farmyard, looking around with expressions of curiosity and something deeper, some instinctive recognition of significance. "This is it," Diane said to her sons. "This is where I was born, where your grandmother Evelyn lived and died, where your grandfather Hank spent his whole life thinking about me." Caleb showed them through the house, watching their reactions as they took in the sparse rooms and worn furniture and the weight of history that hung in the air like humidity. The grandchildren were less reverent, excited by the novelty of an old farmhouse with its creaky stairs and odd corners. They ran through the rooms with the careless energy of the young, while the adults moved more slowly, more thoughtfully. In the bedroom where Diane was born, everyone grew quiet. The children sensed the shift in mood and stilled, looking to their parents for cues. Marcus stood at the window looking out over the cornfield, his jaw tight. "All those years," he said, "right here, 90 miles from where we lived our whole lives." "He could have come," Simon added, but his tone was more sad than angry. "Any time. He could have just driven over and have knocked on our door." "He could have," Diane agreed, "but he believed he had no right. He believed he had forfeited that right when he signed the adoption papers. And maybe more than that, he believed his presence would hurt me rather than help me." She told them then about the medical records Caleb had found, about Hank's depression and suicide attempts, and his conviction that he carried a genetic curse. Marcus and Simon listened with the focused attention of men trying to understand something that defied easy comprehension. "That is heartbreaking," Jennifer said softly. "To be so convinced you are poison that you deny yourself the thing you want most." "And it was wrong," Marcus said. "Factually wrong. Mom did not inherit his depression. None of us did. He tortured himself for nothing." "Not for nothing," Diane corrected gently. "He tortured himself because he loved me, because he wanted better for me than what he thought he could provide. That does not make it right, but it makes it understandable." They gathered in the living room and Caleb brought out more of what he had found. The photographs of Evelyn and Hank in happier times, the wedding dress picture, the house plans, the letters Evelyn had written begging Hank to raise their daughter. Diane read them aloud and her voice broke more than once, but she pushed through, determined that everyone should hear Evelyn's words. "She wanted him to keep me," Diane said when she finished the last letter. "She trusted him. She believed in him. And he could not believe in himself." The children had gotten restless and gone outside to explore, their voices carrying through the open windows. The adults sat in silence for a while, each processing in their own way. Then Simon spoke up. "What do we do with this? All this history, all this pain. It cannot just sit here in boxes. It has to mean something." "That is what I have been thinking about all week," Diane said. And I have an idea, but I wanted to talk to all of you before I did anything. She laid out her vision. The farm was legally hers and Caleb's, half and half according to Hank's will. Neither of them needed it financially. Caleb had his career in engineering and Diane had her retirement savings and her late husband's life insurance. But the land itself, the house, the legacy of the place, that had value beyond money. What if we turned it into something that helps people? Diane said. People in situations like Hank and Evelyn were in, young parents facing impossible choices, families dealing with medical crises. We could create a foundation, fund it with the farm's value, and use it to provide support that my parents never had. What kind of support? Marcus asked, his lawyer's mind already working through logistics. Everything, Diane said. Financial assistance for medical bills, counseling for people struggling with depression or grief, respite care for single parents who are overwhelmed, scholarships for young people from struggling families. We could call it the Evelyn and Hank Brennan Foundation. Make their story of loss into something that prevents loss for others. The room was quiet as everyone considered this. Then Caleb spoke. He would have liked that. Using the farm he poured his life into to help people who are hurting the way he hurt. Turning his silence into something that speaks for people who cannot speak for themselves. I will handle the legal structure, Marcus said. Set it up as a nonprofit, get the tax status sorted, make sure it is all done properly. And I can help with outreach, Simon added. Work with schools and community organizations to identify people who need help. Make sure the assistance actually reaches the people who need it most. Over the next several hours, they talked through the details, sketching out a structure and mission statement, identifying potential partners and funding sources. The initial capital would come from keeping the farmhouse but selling most of the acreage to neighboring farmers, keeping only enough land around the house for the building itself and perhaps a small garden. The house would become the foundation's office and a meeting space for support groups. The barn could be converted into a community center. We should keep old Ben, one of the grandchildren called from outside where they had discovered the leaning scarecrow. Everyone went out to look. The children had gathered around the weathered figure, fascinated by its strange construction and the way it seemed to watch over the field despite its crooked stance. Old Ben has been guarding this place for longer than I have been alive, Caleb said. My grandfather told me once that a good scarecrow is not just about scaring birds. It is about keeping watch, about standing witness, about being present even when it is hard. Then he stays, Diane said firmly. We fix him up, make him straight again, but he stays. Let him keep watching. Let him be a reminder that even broken things can serve a purpose. They spent the rest of the afternoon working together to repair the scarecrow. Marcus and Simon dug out the rotted post while Caleb and David built a new support structure. Jennifer and Diane sorted through the straw and flannel, salvaging what they could and supplementing with fresh materials. The children supervised and offered advice and got in the way in the manner of children everywhere. And slowly working together across generations and bloodlines and the complicated geography of family, they brought old Ben back to standing. When it was done, when the scarecrow stood straight and solid in its old position, they all stepped back to admire their work. The figure looked newer, but still weathered, repaired but not replaced, a visual metaphor for what they were trying to do with the whole farm and the whole story. As the sun started its descent toward the horizon, painting the cornfield in shades of gold, Diane asked if they could have a small ceremony. Nothing religious necessarily, just a moment to acknowledge what this place meant and what they were going to do with it. They gathered in a loose circle around old Ben, 3 generations standing together in the fading light. Diane stood in the center, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly in the evening stillness. My mother Evelyn died in that house when I was 3 days old. My father Hank lived in that house for 60 years, carrying a grief and a love so profound that it shaped every day of his life. I never knew either of them, never heard their voices or felt their touch. But standing here now, surrounded by my children and grandchildren, and by Caleb who shares this legacy, I feel connected to them in ways I cannot fully explain. She paused, collecting herself. We cannot change the past. We cannot bring them back or undo the choices they made or erase the pain they endured. But we can honor them. We can take their story of loss and sacrifice and turn it into something that helps others. We can make sure that their love, which had nowhere to go for so long, finally finds a purpose. I forgive you, she said, looking toward the house and the bedroom window where she had been born. Both of you, for dying, for leaving, for all the years we lost. I forgive you and I release you. May you finally be at peace, and may the work we do here in your names help others find peace too. There were tears on multiple faces, but also smiles. The children, not fully understanding but sensing the importance of the moment, grew solemn. And in the quiet that followed Diane's words, a breeze moved through the corn with its particular rustling whisper. And somewhere in the distance, a mourning dove called its evening song. They walked back to the house as darkness gathered, and Caleb made coffee while everyone settled in the living room. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, to the logistics of the foundation and stories about Hank that Caleb shared, and memories of Bob Thornton that Diane offered. The children eventually fell asleep in various chairs and corners, exhausted by the fresh air and excitement. Later, after everyone else had gone to bed in various rooms throughout the house, Caleb and Diane sat on the porch in the rocking chairs that had been there since before either of them was born. The night was clear and cool, the sky crowded with stars that were never visible in the city, and the silence was profound. "Thank you," Diane said quietly, "for finding me, for telling me, for giving me this. I did not give you anything. I just shared what was already yours. You gave me a father. Even if I never got to meet him, you gave me the knowledge that he existed and that he loved me. That is more than I thought I would ever have. He gave you more than that." Caleb gestured toward the farmland stretching away into darkness. "He gave you this place, this legacy, a foundation on which to build something good. We are building it together." "Yes, we are." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, rocking slowly, listening to the night sounds. Then Diane spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "I keep thinking about that day in 2004 when I came here and sat in my car at the end of the driveway. I was so close to knocking on that door, so close to demanding answers. But I saw you playing in the yard, this little boy who looked so happy and so secure, and I could not bring myself to disrupt that. I drove away and told myself it was for the best, that some mysteries were better left unsolved. And now I am glad I waited. Not because the waiting was good, but because the timing was right. If I had knocked on that door in 2004, he would have been terrified. He would have tried to explain and failed. It would have been painful and awkward and probably would have ended badly for everyone. But now, with him gone and you as the bridge between us, we can see the whole story. We can understand without the complications of his shame and my anger. We can grieve and heal and move forward. You think he planned it that way? Maybe not consciously, but he left the journals where you would find them. He left instructions about the farm going to both of us. He created a situation where we would have to find each other. On some level, I think he knew. Caleb considered this. His grandfather had been a man of few words but many actions, someone who expressed himself through what he did rather than what he said. Perhaps this had been his final act of love, creating the conditions for healing, even though he would not be around to see it. "What would you say to him if you could?" Caleb asked. "If he were here right now, what would you tell him?" Diane rocked in silence for a long time before answering. "I would tell him I understand. I would tell him I forgive him. And I would tell him that I turned out okay, that his sacrifice, his silence, his distance, they did not ruin me. I built a good life. I loved and was loved. I raised good sons who are raising good children. And now I am going to use what he left me to help others build good lives too. I would tell him that his story does not end in tragedy. It ends in hope." She turned to look at Caleb in the darkness. "And I would tell him thank you. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go. Thank you for watching over me even when it cost you everything. Thank you for being my father in the only way you knew how. It was not the way I would have chosen, but it was enough. It had to be enough, and in the end, it was." They sat together on that porch long into the night, two branches of a family tree that had grown separately for decades finally grafting together, stronger for the joining. Inside the house, 3 generations slept peacefully, unaware of the weight of history pressing down on this place, innocent of the sacrifices made in the name of love. And out in the field, old Ben stood watch as he had always stood watch, arms outstretched toward a sky full of stars, keeping faith with his post, bearing witness to the slow turn of seasons and the slower healing of wounds. The scarecrow knew nothing of grief or forgiveness or the complicated calculus of family. But if he could have spoken, Perhaps he would have said what the land itself seemed to whisper in the rustling of corn and the movement of wind. That time passes. That pain fades. That love, real love, survives even when everything else falls away. And that sometimes, just sometimes, broken things can be made whole again. 6 months after that weekend, when 3 generations gathered to repair Old Ben and reimagine the future of the Brennan farm, the official paperwork for the Evelyn and Hank Brennan Foundation was signed in a lawyer's office in Lincoln. Marcus had worked tirelessly to structure it properly, navigating the maze of nonprofit regulations and tax codes with the focused determination he brought to everything. The foundation would be funded initially by the sale of 240 acres of farmland to neighboring operations, keeping 80 acres around the house for the foundation's use. The sale brought in enough capital to fund operations for at least a decade, longer if they were careful and supplemented with grants and donations. But before any of that official business could proceed, there was something else that needed to happen. Something more personal and more important than paperwork and bank accounts. Diane had asked Caleb if they could hold a memorial service for Hank and Evelyn, a proper gathering where family and friends could come together to honor two people whose love story had been lived mostly in silence but deserved to be spoken aloud. The service was scheduled for a Sunday in early October when the corn had been harvested and the fields lay bare and golden stubble stretched to the horizon under an impossibly blue sky. Diane had wanted to hold it at the farm itself rather than in a church, and Caleb had agreed immediately. This land had been consecrated by 60 years of quiet devotion. It was already holy ground. The guest list was small. Diane's family came, of course, Marcus and Simon with their partners and children. Michael Price drove down from his retirement community in Omaha, bringing with him a box of letters that Hank had sent him over the years, fragments of the old man's inner life shared with the one friend he had trusted. Pastor Riley from the Methodist Church agreed to officiate despite the unconventional location, saying that God was just as present in a cornfield as in any building with a steeple. Ruth Henderson came, the elderly neighbor who had known Evelyn and witnessed the early days of Hank's grief. And Bob Thornton, Diane's adoptive father, made the trip despite his advancing Parkinson's, determined to pay respects to the man whose daughter he had raised. They set up folding chairs in rows facing the farmhouse, and at the front they placed 2 photographs side by side. Evelyn as a young woman, luminous and smiling. Hank in his 30s, serious but with gentle eyes. Between the photos sat a single vase holding stalks of dried corn and sprigs of goldenrod, the flowers of late harvest, native and unpretentious and exactly right. Caleb stood off to the side as people arrived and took their seats, watching Diane greet each person with quiet warmth. She had changed in the past 6 months. Not in obvious ways, but in the subtle shifts of posture and expression that marked someone who had found answers to questions that had haunted them for a lifetime. She stood straighter. She smiled more easily. And when she spoke about Hank, which she did often now, there was no anger in her voice, only a deep sadness for time lost and a deeper gratitude for the love that had persisted despite everything. Pastor Riley called them to order with a prayer that was mercifully brief and focused on themes of forgiveness and redemption and the mysterious ways that grace worked in the world. Then Diane stood and walked to the front, carrying the journal that Caleb had given her, the one that covered the year she was born. "I want to read you something," she said, her voice carrying clearly in the still autumn air. "This is from my father's journal, written 3 days after I was born and 1 day after my mother died." She opened the book to a page marked with a ribbon and began to read. "Evelyn is gone. The funeral is tomorrow, and I do not know how I will stand upright through it. Diane is staying with the Thorntons tonight. They came to the hospital and Bob examined her and pronounced her healthy. Ellen held her and wept with joy. They have wanted a child for so long, and here is this perfect tiny creature who needs parents, and I am not one. I am just a broken man who cannot see past his own grief long enough to imagine a future." Diane paused, composing herself. "I sat with Diane for an hour before the Thorntons took her. She has Evelyn's face. When she opens her eyes, they are blue like mine, but the shape of them is pure Evelyn. I told her things I will never tell another soul. I told her about her mother, about how brave Evelyn was, about how she chose to die young so that Diane could live. I told her I was sorry. Sorry I could not be stronger. Sorry I could not be the father Evelyn wanted me to be. Sorry that the best I could give her was to give her away." She closed the journal and looked out at the gathered faces. That is the only record of him holding me. 1 hour, 61 years ago. And for most of my life, I did not even know it happened. But now I do. Now I know that he held me and spoke to me and loved me, even if he could not keep me. And that changes everything. She set the journal down and picked up a letter, this one written on different paper in a feminine hand. This is from my mother, she said, written to my father 2 weeks before I was born. Caleb found it among my father's things. Dearest Hank, I am writing this on a day when I feel well enough to think clearly. The doctors say I have weeks at most. I am not afraid of dying. I am only afraid of leaving you and our daughter to face the world without me. But I have been thinking about what it means to be a parent, and I have realized something important. Being a parent is not about being perfect. It is not about having all the answers or never making mistakes. It is about showing up. It is about loving your child even when you are tired or scared or uncertain. It is about doing your best with whatever you have to give. Diane's voice wavered, but she continued. You are going to be a wonderful father, Hank. You are kind and patient and steady. You work hard and you keep your promises and you love deeply even when it costs you. Our daughter is so lucky to have you. Please do not doubt yourself. Please do not let fear convince you that you are not enough. You are enough. You have always been enough. I love you with everything I am and everything I was and everything I might have been. Take care of our girl. Tell her about me. And please, my darling, please take care of yourself too. Your Evelyn. The silence that followed was profound. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Diane folded the letter carefully and returned it to her pocket, then looked up with tears streaming down her face. He did not keep his promise to her, she said. He did not raise me. He did not tell me about her. But I understand now that he broke his promise because he loved me, not because he did not. He thought he was saving me from himself, from his depression and his grief and his fear that he would damage me just by being near me. And maybe he was wrong. Maybe we could have found a way to be a family despite everything. But maybe it's not the same as knowing, and all he could do was make the best choice he could with the information he had. She paused, gathering herself. So today I want to do what he could not do while he was alive. I want to release him from that promise. I want to tell him that it is okay, that I understand, that I forgive him. And I want to thank him for all the ways he was a father to me, even when he could not claim that title. The scholarship that paid for my education, the mortgage payment that saved my childhood home, the birthday gifts that arrived every year like clockwork, the presents at my wedding and my graduations, and all the important moments of my life. He was there. He was always there, just not in the way either of us would have chosen. She turned to look at the photographs of her parents. I release you both from promises and guilt and the weight of choices made in impossible circumstances. Rest now, you have carried this long enough. And know that the daughter you loved and worried over and sacrificed for turned out just fine. Better than fine. I had a good life. I have a good life. And now I am going to use what you left me to make sure other people have good lives too. Your story does not end in tragedy. It ends in hope. It ends in healing. It ends in love multiplied across generations. That is your legacy. That is what you built together even though you did not live to see it. When she sat down, there was not a dry eye among the assembled group. Marcus stood next and spoke about discovering this hidden family history, about what it meant to suddenly understand where certain features and mannerisms had come from, about feeling connected to people he had never met, but who had shaped him nonetheless through the genetic inheritance they had passed down. Simon followed and read a poem he had written about scarecrows and watchfulness, and the ways people stand guard over the things they love, even when standing is all they can do. Then Bob Thornton rose with difficulty, leaning heavily on his cane, and made his way slowly to the front. His voice when he spoke was thin and reedy, but clear enough. I only met Hank Brennan once, he said. It was at Evelyn's grave maybe 40 years ago. I had gone there to put flowers on her stone because Ellen and I always felt we owed her a debt we could never repay. She gave us Diane. She gave us the greatest gift of our lives. And while I was standing there, this man appeared. Tall, weathered, with the saddest eyes I had ever seen. We looked at each other and did not speak. We did not need to speak. I understood who he was, and he understood who I was, and we both understood what we were doing there. Bob paused, his hands shaking on the cane. He nodded to me, just once, and I nodded back. And then he left. But every year after that, when I visited Evelyn's grave, there would be fresh flowers already there. Someone else was tending that grave. Someone else was keeping watch. I knew it was him. I knew he had never stopped loving her. And I knew he had never stopped caring about Diane, even though he had given her to us. The old man's eyes were wet. I want to say thank you. Thank you for trusting us with your daughter. Thank you for all the ways you supported our family without taking credit. And thank you for raising Caleb to be the kind of young man who would honor your memory by bringing this family together. You were a good man, Hank Brennan. I wish I had told you that when I had the chance. Bob sat down and Ellen took his hand, and they wept together quietly, these two people who had loved Diane as their own and who now understood the full cost of the gift they had been given. Michael Price spoke next, sharing stories of his friendship with Hank that spanned half a century. He told about the monthly drives to Des Moines, about Hank sitting in the car watching Diane's house with a notebook in his lap, writing down every detail he could observe. He told about the careful selection of birthday gifts, about how Hank would spend weeks choosing just the right book or scarf or trinket, wanting each gift to somehow convey the love he could not express directly. He told about the last conversation he had with Hank, 2 weeks before the old man died. He knew he was dying, Michael said. The cancer had spread, and the doctors had stopped talking about treatment and started talking about hospice. And Hank said to me, I am afraid, not of dying, but of dying without her knowing, without Diane understanding that she was loved. And I told him she will know. Somehow, someday she will know. He wanted to believe me, but I could see he doubted it. So I am glad to be here today to tell him he was wrong. She knows, Hank. She knows and she understands and she forgives. You can rest now. When it was Caleb's turn to speak, he almost could not do it. The weight of everything he had learned over the past 6 months pressed down on him, all the secrets uncovered and stories revealed, and truths that had reshaped his understanding of the man who raised him. But he stood and walked to the front and looked out at the assembled group and found his voice. My grandfather was not a perfect man, he said. He made choices that hurt people, especially himself. He lived with regret and depression and a grief so profound it nearly destroyed him. But he also loved with a purity and constancy that I am only beginning to understand. He loved Evelyn, he loved Diane, and he loved me. 3 people, 3 completely different relationships, 3 different ways of expressing devotion that all came from the same deep well of his capacity for caring. Caleb picked up one of the journals, the final one. In his last entry, written the day before he died, he wrote this: I am thinking about promises today. The promises I made and kept, and the promises I made and broke. I promised Evelyn I would raise our daughter, and I failed. But I also promised myself I would keep Diane safe and happy, even if I could not be part of her life, and that promise I kept. I promised my grandson Caleb that he would always have a home, and I kept that promise too. We make so many promises in life, to others and to ourselves, to the living and to the dead, and we cannot keep them all. Sometimes we have to choose. Sometimes we have to break one promise to keep another. I hope I chose right. I hope the promises I broke will be forgiven, and the promises I kept will be remembered. That is all any of us can hope for in the end. Caleb closed the journal. I think he chose right, he said. Not perfectly, but right enough. He kept the promises that mattered most. And now it is our turn to make promises and keep them. We promise to honor his memory, to continue the work of caring for people who are struggling, to turn his story of loss into something that creates gain for others. That is the promise we make today, all of us together. After the formal service ended, people mingled and shared food that had been laid out on tables near the house. The children ran through the stubbled field, their voices bright in the autumn air. Bob Thornton sat in the shade talking with Michael Price, 2 old men comparing notes on the young man they had both known in different ways and different times. Marcus and Simon stood with Caleb looking at the barn that would soon be renovated into the Foundation's community center, discussing timelines and contractors and budgets. And Diane walked alone to where old Ben stood at his post, newly repaired and standing straight, his straw arms spread wide as if welcoming the world. She stood before the scarecrow for a long time, and when Caleb joined her, she did not acknowledge his presence immediately, just kept staring up at that rough assemblage of wood and cloth that had marked the spot where her father's secrets lay buried for so long. "Do you think he is at peace now?" she asked finally. "I think he found peace before he died," Caleb said. "Not complete peace, maybe, but enough. The last few years after I came to live with him, he seemed more settled, like he had found a purpose again. Raising me gave him something to focus on besides his regrets. He saved you, you know." Diane turned to look at him. "When your parents died and you needed someone, he could have let social services place you somewhere. He was old, he was alone, he had no legal obligation to take you in. But he did it anyway, because that is who he was, someone who showed up when he was needed, even when it cost him everything." "He saved me," Caleb agreed. "And maybe in some way, saving me saved him too. Gave him a second chance to be the father he could not be to you." They stood together in companionable silence, watching the autumn light play across the land. In the distance, the children's laughter rose and fell like birdsong. The smell of coffee and pie drifted from the house, and old Ben stood watch over it all, faithful to his post, bearing witness to this gathering of a family that had been scattered and was now, finally, coming together. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, people began to drift away. Hugs were exchanged, promises made to stay in touch, plans discussed for the foundation's official opening in the spring. Michael Price gave Caleb the box of letters Hank had sent him over the years, saying they belonged with the rest of the archive now. Bob and Ellen Thornton held Diane for a long moment before departing. No words needed between parents and child, even when the relationship was built on adoption rather than biology. The grandchildren were loaded into cars, sleepy and satisfied from a day spent running free on land that was somehow theirs, even though they had never seen it before. Finally, only Caleb and Diane remained, sitting on the porch steps as the sun dropped toward the horizon and painted the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep blue. Neither felt any need to rush. The day had been full and meaningful, and there was a pleasant exhaustion that came from emotional labor well done. "What happens now?" Diane asked. "Now we work," Caleb said. "We get the foundation running. We help people. We make their sacrifice mean something. And after that, we keep working. We live our lives. We tell their story to anyone who will listen. We make sure Evelyn and Hank are remembered not for what they lost, but for what they gave." Diane nodded slowly. "I have been thinking about the house. This house. It is going to be the foundation's headquarters, but it is also where I was born, where my mother died, where my father lived his whole life. It seems wrong to just turn it into offices and meeting rooms. What are you suggesting? Maybe we keep one room as a memorial. My mother's room, the bedroom where I was born. We could put her photographs there and my father's journals and some of the letters. Create a space where people can come and learn their story. Not as a sad thing, but as a testament to the power of love and sacrifice." "I like that," Caleb said. "A reminder of why the foundation exists, of the real people and real pain and real devotion that started all this." They sat quietly for a while longer, watching the light fade. Then Diane reached into her pocket and pulled out a small envelope. "I found this yesterday," she said. "It was in the box with my mother's letters. I have been carrying it around all day, trying to decide whether to open it." "What is it?" "I do not know. It is addressed to me in my father's handwriting, but there is no date. It could be from any time in the last 60 years. "Are you going to open it?" Diane turned the envelope over in her hands, studying it. "I am afraid," she admitted. "I am afraid it will say something that undoes all the healing we have done. Something angry or bitter or full of regret that will make me doubt everything." "Do you want me to read it first?" She considered this, then shook her head. "No, if there is one more thing my father wanted to say to me, I should hear it directly, even if it hurts." She opened the envelope carefully and pulled out a single sheet of paper. As she read, Caleb watched her face, trying to gauge her reaction. But Diane's expression remained neutral, unreadable, until she reached the end. Then she smiled, just slightly, and looked up at the darkening sky. "What does it say?" Caleb asked. She handed him the letter. "It is dated March 15th, 2024, my 60th birthday, 2 weeks before he died." Caleb read aloud. "My dearest Diane, today you turn 60 years old. 60 years since I last held you. 60 years since I made the choice that defined both our lives. I do not know if you will ever read this letter. I do not know if Caleb will find these journals and find you and give you access to this story I have kept hidden for so long. But I am writing it anyway because there is something I need you to know. I do not regret giving you to the Thorntons. I regret that circumstances made it necessary. I regret that your mother died so young. I regret that I was not strong enough to keep you myself. But I do not regret the actual decision because it gave you a life I could not have provided. You have been loved. You have been safe. You have flourished. And watching you flourish, even from a distance, has been the greatest joy of my life. If I could go back and do it differently, I do not know that I would. The man I was at 23 did not have the tools or resources or mental health to raise a child alone. I was drowning in grief and depression, and I truly believed you were better off without me. Maybe I was right. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe it is not a question that has a clear answer. All I know is that I made the best choice I could with what I had, and I have spent 60 years trying to honor that choice by watching over you from afar. You are 60 today. I am 83 and dying. By the time you read this, if you ever do, I will be gone. I will never know if you forgive me or understand me or think I was a coward and a failure. But I want you to know this. Every good thing in your life has made me proud. Every hardship you overcame has made me marvel at your strength. Every smile I glimpsed from a distance has warmed my heart. You have been my daughter every day of your life, even though I was never your father in any way that counted. Be happy. That is all I ever wanted for you. Be happy and know that somewhere, somehow, there was a man who loved you more than his own life and proved it by letting you go. Your father always, Hank. Caleb set the letter down, unable to speak. Diane took it back and folded it carefully, returning it to the envelope. That is what I needed to hear, she said softly. Not an apology, not an explanation, just the truth. He loved me. He wanted me to be happy, and in his own imperfect way, he spent his whole life working toward that goal. And you were happy? I was. I am. The Thorntons gave me a wonderful childhood. Bob was a great father. Ellen was a great mother. I had opportunities and love and stability. And now, knowing the full story, I can appreciate what they gave me even more because I understand what it cost my biological father to give me to them. So it was worth it, his sacrifice. I think so, yes. Not perfectly, not without pain, but worth it. As full darkness fell, they went inside and made dinner together in the kitchen where Hank had cooked thousands of meals, talking easily about practical things like the foundation's first grant proposals and the renovation timeline for the barn. But underneath the ordinary conversation ran a current of profound understanding. They were not just planning an organization. They were keeping a promise. They were honoring a love that had survived death and distance and 60 years of silence. They were proving that broken things could be made whole, that lost stories could be found and told, that even the saddest beginnings could lead to hopeful endings. Later, after Diane had driven back to Des Moines and Caleb was alone in the house, he walked through the rooms, turning off lights. In each space he paused, remembering. The living room where his grandfather had sat every evening, the kitchen where they had shared meals in comfortable silence, the bedroom upstairs where an old man had slept alone for 6 decades, dreaming of the daughter he had loved and lost and loved again from afar. He stopped at the window that looked out over the field where old Ben stood watch. The scarecrow was barely visible in the darkness, just a shape against the stars. But Caleb knew it was there, standing guard, keeping faith, bearing witness. Tomorrow he would begin the work of transforming this place. Contractors would come with their plans and equipment. The barn would be gutted and rebuilt. The house would be altered to serve new purposes. The land itself would take on a different meaning, becoming not just a farm but a foundation, a source of help for people in need. But tonight it was still just what it had always been, a house where people had loved and lost and endured, a piece of earth that had soaked up 60 years of silent devotion and was now ready to give something back. A keeper's post where promises were made and broken and made again, where love found ways to persist even when everything seemed designed to extinguish it. Caleb went to his grandfather's desk and pulled out the journal he had been keeping since the day he found the first box of secrets. He had taken up the practice of writing, documenting the strange journey of discovery and healing, creating a record for future generations who might wonder how it all happened. He wrote about the memorial service and the letters and the plans for the foundation. He wrote about Diane's smile when she read her father's final words to her. He wrote about the feeling of rightness that had settled over the farm as people gathered to honor two lives that had been lived largely in shadow but deserved to be celebrated in light. And then, because it seemed important to mark the moment, he wrote one final entry for the day. We made promises today, to Evelyn and to Hank and to each other. We promised to remember and to honor and to transform their story into something that helps others. These are promises we can keep. These are promises we will keep. Not perfectly, perhaps, but faithfully, with the same devotion they showed in their own imperfect way. That is what it means to be a keeper, not to protect secrets, but to protect the people those secrets were meant to shield, to stand watch over the things that matter, to love even when loving is hard, to persist even when the world offers every reason to quit. They taught us that, Evelyn and Hank. They taught us without meaning to, without even knowing we would exist to learn from them. And now we take that lesson forward into whatever comes next. He closed the journal and sat in the quiet house, feeling the weight of all those who had sat in this same spot before him. His grandfather, his great-grandparents, all the Brennans who had worked this land and loved this place and left their mark upon it in ways both visible and hidden. The legacy was his now, his and Diane's and all the family members who would come after them. Not a legacy of land or money or material things, though those were part of it, but a legacy of something more valuable and more enduring. The legacy of love that persists, of promises kept even when keeping them requires sacrifice, of hope that survives even the darkest grief. Outside in the field, old Ben stood under the stars, arms spread wide, keeping watch as he had always kept watch. The corn was harvested now, the field bare and ready for winter. But spring would come as it always came, and new crops would be planted, and the cycle would continue. Life moving forward, building on the foundation of all that came before, forever changed by the past but not imprisoned by it. And in the house where Diane had been born, and Evelyn had died, and Hank had lived out his quiet vigil, Caleb Brennan turned out the last light and went to bed, grateful for scarecrows and journals and secrets that were meant to be found. Grateful for grandfathers who loved him perfectly, but loved nonetheless. Grateful for the strange and painful and ultimately redemptive ways that families found each other across the years. The story was not over. It would never be over. Stories like this one did not end. They simply evolved, passing from generation to generation, changing shape but retaining their essential truth. Love persists. Sacrifice matters. Promises, even broken ones, have power. And sometimes, if you are very fortunate, the keeper of secrets becomes the keeper of hope, transforming what was hidden into what heals, what was silent into what speaks, what was broken into what makes others whole. Out in the field, the wind moved through the empty corn rows with its particular autumn whisper. Old Ben creaked slightly on his post but held firm, faithful to the end. And over it all, the stars wheeled slowly in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human drama, but beautiful in their constancy, lighting the darkness, keeping their own watch, bearing witness to all that was and is and will be. The keeper's promise had been fulfilled. Not as originally intended, perhaps, but fulfilled nonetheless. And that, in the end, was more than enough.